There's an article up right now on Newsarama, an editorial, an opinion piece. And the basic premise is that writers right now in comics need to make it count. So, what does that mean, make it count? Well, the premise of the article is basically that while things are shut down, while we're facing a kind of unknown future, comic publishers, writers, creators need to be pulling out the stops to tell that amazing story, that amazing comic that counts. I think that there's a lot of wisdom to this, and I want to go into it. Hey, everybody, this is Perch. I've made comments like this before, but this one is a little bit more in the head. I read this article, and it's coming at it from a very kind of high level view of basically that now we have time. Now we're forced inside our houses. Now and I have gotten irritated at the articles like, now that you can't go to work and you have to work at home, there's no excuse not to learn how to be a biophysicist. It's like, well, okay, slow your roll there. A lot of us are, a lot of people are tired, stressed out, exhausted, not knowing if their jobs are going to be secured. Not always the best environment in picking up a new skill. A lot of people confuse, picking up a new skill with, hey, I found an extra 2 hours in the day, so let's learn how to cook. Sounds good, but your time and your body and your mind all have to be in some level of alignment to learn these new skills and really enjoy and immerse yourself in them. Just saying, hey, good news, you got fired, now you can write that book you've always wanted to write. It doesn't usually work out that way. You're usually stressed out of your mind. That's where a lot of people are. But be that as it may, the article makes the point that with comic books facing an unknown future, now is the time for the writers, the creators, the publishers, the editors, so on, to really, pull out all the stops. You've got some extra time to plan. You've got some extra time to think. You're not facing with your back up against the wall for a deadline. Let's get that amazing story out. And on one hand, you could look at it and you could say, hey, this is a perfect opportunity for some creators to get that, Indiegogo, that Kickstarter, whatever it happens to be, that book that they're going to do on their own out the door. People like Brett Booth, pushing off his. And there's a lot of creators right now pushing off these kind of independent works, and good for them. They should do that. On the publisher side, I think there's a bit of a wake-up call that has been needed for the industry for a long time. So yes, we're looking at this through the lens of COVID, but the reality is comic books for a while have just not mattered in terms of the story. It's this trap of the decompressed story, the time filler story, which has kind of existed. I think some creators that came from the indie comics world like telling those kinds of stories. They like telling those slice of life, coming of age, inner realization kind of stories. And then they get over to cape books, superhero books, and that style does not work, or at least not full time. It's okay to have some, down moments, some quiet time, some introspective time, but you also have to have some big moments that matter, that you remember, that are important. And before anyone goes, you're beating up on current comics. No, there's been other times in the mid to late 90s. If you look at Marvel, you look at the Avengers, which I'm doing now, you look at X-Men, you look at several of the comics that were coming out during this time, you will discover that the storylines are largely forgettable. I mean, they're printing comics, but it didn't matter. The storylines just felt bleh. There wasn't any kind of big thing, and a lot of them were filled with action, but they're action that just nobody cared. If you look at the Fantastic Four during its time with John Byrne, and you look at the Fantastic Four 10 years later, you see a title, on one hand, it's telling very memorable stories, very important things. And yes, that takes skill, and not everybody's going to have that skill. But you look at it 10 years later, and you see a lot of kind of quick retcons and, here's a secret, but it doesn't really matter. And so now I will bring up some current comics. You take a look at the new Fantastic Four. So the Fantastic Four had been a comic that got canceled. It was a beloved franchise of Marvel, but at the same time, sales went up on it. So they put it on the shelf for a few years. We had Secret Wars kind of go on, and during a pretty messy time in Marvel's life. I mean, the whole Inhumans push and all that kind of stuff. It just, Johnny Storm's banging Medusa. I mean, it all around, it was a very forgettable time. much like the mid to late 90s, has become a forgettable time in comics for Marvel. Um, so the Fantastic Four, finally, it's like, we're going to bring this comic back, much hype, much love. Dan Slott, who is coming off of an Amazing Spider-Man run, whether you like Dan Slott, hate Dan Slott did have a memorable Amazing Spider-Man run, did some things in there that certainly moved comics, sold books, was considered, big. And then you bring in Sarah Pacelli, who's an artist with some, who definitely has a strong name, a marquee team, and you hype it for this book that's finally returning due to fan demand. They can't wait. We had Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, and that was super huge, and people liked that, and it led into a lot of the work he did with Avengers and Secret Wars, and finally this comic's coming back. And what do? You dive into some very uneven stories that don't feel like they matter. Right off the bat, we get a story that just, was just kind of there with a new villain that was hyped to be a big deal, but then kind of defeated very quickly. And I guess they brought back some past members of the Fantastic Four to kind of, as a kind of a nostalgia thing, but its return felt very flat. Weirdly, Chip Zdarsky was doing the Human Torch and Thing book, which felt more like a Fantastic Four book, which you definitely had the emotional heartstrings of his family is kind of torn apart and trying to get back to finding Reed and Sue and Doctor Doom and all that kind of stuff. And then you get the Fantastic Four core book, and this first arc was, even the reunion felt like, just very much didn't matter. You went into a Doctor Doom storyline that was largely forgettable. And then you do a couple of kind of slice of life stories of, Franklin's doing something wacky. And then you send them off into space to fight the villain they never knew they had. And Johnny Storm gets a soulmate and all the rest. And you look at this run and you can now look back on it and go, well, maybe you enjoy some of the issues. Some of the issues have been enjoyable to read. But as a whole, is this memorable? Or does this feel like we're just filling time with these characters? And in defense of the creators, oftentimes Marvel editorial, DC editorial, and the publisher themselves is saying, fill time with these characters. They're not saying go knock it out of the park. They're saying, well, you have a 12-issue run, so just don't try and do anything too crazy. Donny Cates is enjoying a lot of success with with Thanos, and then with Venom, and now with Thor, largely because he swung for the fences in what he did. Jonathan Hickman's X-Men story was a major bold new status quo designed to be remembered. Maybe not everybody has those ideas, but if you compare them to, say, the revolving door, we've had some talented writers, Scotty Young, on Deadpool. We've had a bunch of people on Deadpool, and by and large, has anything been really memorable in the last 3 runs or so of Deadpool? Or does it matter? Kelly Thompson's on it now. He Deadpool's king of the monsters, fighting Kraven the Hunter. She self-inserted that land shark character that she's so fond of into it. But does it matter? 10 years from now, will these issues be remembered? I don't think they will. And again, it's easy to knock the writer, but if the publisher's telling you, we're not giving any kind of commitment, so don't do crazy things. If they say things like Dan Didio and Joe Quesada on his show were talking about never give characters, never give a creator who really loves those characters that book, because they won't do it right because they can't see past their love for the character. It's like, okay, but is what we've seen over the last several years the result of people who don't love the character? Donny Cates says he loves Venom. Has always really, really super loved Venom. I think he has a tattoo. I don't know. But it shows that book, whether you like the stories or don't like the stories, you do feel like something is happening and it's pushing stuff along. I didn't like the conclusion to Absolute Carnage that basically set up the next event. I thought that was a cheap out. I would have liked a more conclusive ending. But you can't deny stuff's happening in that book. And so back to the premises, this Newsarama article, make it count. These comics, if you want them to be successful again, if you want the sales to go in, we can all debate that this creator over that creator, or this social thing versus that social thing, or whatever else. But if the story matters, the comic will sell. People will remember it. People will come back to it. If you telegraph the comic, it feels just so much that it just does not matter, that what's happening here is irrelevant, then people sense that they don't buy in, they don't invest, and it just kind of vanishes. So to comic books right now, they need to count, they need to matter, they need to be written in such a way that 10 years from now we're talking about these stories. And once again, I'll repeat once again, this isn't just a right now problem. A lot of the people who are anti-Marvel or kind of really fed up with mainstream comics like to portray it all as something happened. I think some of the bigger YouTubers have cited those. Oh, back in 2010, 2012, something happened, and then we got this. We got SJW Comics, and that's fine. I mean, anybody can have a theory, but this is not the first time this has happened. There were eras in the late 70s, definitely, that fell into this trap. DC paid a heavy price for it. In the early 80s, a lot of Marvel books had this issue. In the mid to late 90s, which a lot of people lionize, there was definitely this problem of stories just blurring around. Do you remember when Wasp was turned into some kind of insect creature? Do you remember that? That was the thing. You might not remember it because who cares, And I think one thing about modern comics that definitely accelerates or makes this worse is the constant rebooting, reshuffling. It does send a message to the customers that all this is short term. None of it really matters. If you don't like this comic, just hang out for a year or two. It'll be rebooted anyway. We can start all over again. Maybe that's part of the reason why Captain Marvel has, struggled as a title. A lot of people do like the character. A lot of people don't. A lot of people do. It's not like the interest is not there. You can't make $1 billion in the movie theater and say there's no interest in that character. There is. Chris Claremont did a great job with Carol for many adventures. Brian Reed, I think, did a great job with her too. But if you look at, and I did a video on this recently, if you look at a lot of her books, the adventures just kind of didn't matter. It's like Carol goes off into space and there's some nameless aliens and she does a thing and there's stops civil war and I guess she's a hero, but we don't know who these aliens are and we're certainly never going to see them again. So, okay. That doesn't feel like a comic that matters. Is a story good? It is in some cases. It depends on who the audience is. There's a fan for everything. But in terms of something memorable, something that's going to stand the test of time, and like it or not, the comic business, particularly the big two, is a test of time kind of business. It's these stories that have been running for 70 years. And that there's a gravity to all that time. And it's intimidating, I'm sure, to go in and do this. And if the publisher themselves is telling you, hey, don't do anything crazy here, got to keep the status quo, then yeah, I mean, your momentum to actually do something pretty incredible is probably small. But if you could look at this current situation, the halt of comics, the uncertainty of everything that's going on, the struggle that we're in, if there's one bit of clear advice that publishers and the creators should take, it's make it count. Make your stories matter. If you can do that, I think a lot of good things comes from that. Anyway, what do you think? Does that does this track at all, or it doesn't matter? Let me know your thoughts below. Leave me a comment, like, subscribe, introduce to a friend. Let me know what their thoughts are too. I especially really do love it when I get people who disagree and they've got a different take on things. That's what this is all about. It's not me just telling you how it is. It's trying to create a dialogue, trying to get some other ideas out there. That's the point of what I'm doing anyway. So I'm glad you're along for the ride. Follow me on Twitter at Comic Perch if you want to chat or give me an idea. Always happy to hear it. And thanks for listening.